Chapter 3. Storm. 6 days of drying meat. 6 days of deciding what to keep and what to burn. 6 days of silence. Valyn was unnerved, despite herself. She had drawn out her leave, if only out of curiosity, but it seemed that Asta was truly gone. Still, she could not risk the chance of her showing up with the townsfolk, or even other elves. So, with a pack filled to the brim and a mouth working at dried venison, she stepped out of her cottage for the last time. Sadness welled in her chest, but she pushed it down. The emotion would not serve her. She walked slowly through the trees in the early morning, the sun just peeking over the horizon, the birds in full concert above her head. It was a beautiful send-off, one she did not deserve. She thought of Asta with every step, and realized with a start that the uncomfortable feeling at the back of her mind had been something dangerous. She was worried. 6 days had passed with not a trace of Asta, no more gifts at her door, and no more chance encounters. The girl did not strike Valyn as the type to listen well, so the fact that she had followed directions was bizarre. The worry grew the more she indulged it, like an unpleasant rash she couldn't help but scratch. She had to ignore it, she knew this, and yet, when she saw what looked like a long drag of a boot upon the ground, she followed it. Even as her feet carried her, she told herself to stop at once, to turn the other way, to leave as planned. But the trail was concerning. The boot marks were sloppy, and bushes along the way had been trampled, their leaves toppled to the ground in unnatural ways. Someone had run through here, and a sickening thought began to form in Valyn's mind. She banished it, swallowing down that obtrusive worry. It could be anyone, any lost soul running from whatever they had been fleeing from, and it would do Valyn no favors to follow. Yet she could not stop. The sky darkened, clouds drifting in to block the light, and the smell of coming rain promised to wash away the trail. As the first drops fell, Valyn began to pick up her pace. Her eyes focused solely on the footprints in the dirt, and it seemed she may end up lost herself, until she finally looked up. There was her lake, a dark mirror reflecting the growing storm. The trail led to the cave near the opposite side where she was, and she needed to decide then and there. Though being soaked and miserable while walking to an unknown destination would be the wiser choice, the shelter of the cave became more appealing by the second. Sharing the cave, however, was a different matter entirely. If anything, she knew she wasn't above killing the stranger if it was called for. After all, who could hurt her? As Valyn leaned down to step into the cave, her eyes adjusted to the darkness, though not as quickly as the sound of soft crying reached her ears. She stopped immediately, taking in the sight of a head of navy hair, knees drawn up to her face, arms hugged around her legs. Asta, smiling, bright Asta, curled in on herself with a skirt lined with dirt and debris, her usually silken hair tangled and wild. She hadn't seemed to notice Valyn yet, not with the rain beginning to pour, the water quickly soaking Valyn's still exposed back. She had to choose, and the fact that she had no idea how to comfort a crying girl was making her lean towards leaving. That would be the best for everyone. She began to turn her body to brave the storm outside, until Asta lifted her gaze, and Valyn saw there was just as much of a storm inside. Asta's face did not show any kind of surprise. Instead, it flickered with such a profoundly sad expression that Valyn felt her own chest tighten. Her pale blue eyes were red and puffy, and did not leave Valyn's. They wordlessly stared at each other for what seemed like hours, the rain drowning out any other sounds. It was just them and the storm. Valyn slowly began to inch a bit closer, her body lowering to sit on the ground, so painstakingly that she felt like prey. Asta just watched. Even as Valyn seated herself and looked away, trying to lessen the tense atmosphere, she could still feel the girl's eyes upon her. She had never felt more exposed, with this girl she barely knew looking at her, as if she knew every secret, every regret. Valyn squirmed, willing herself to flee, when Asta finally sighed, soft and shaky. "Hello, Lady Valyn," Asta said, her voice just barely audible over the downpour outside. What brings you here? What did bring her there? She hardly knew herself. It was certainly not any kind of logic. She was tempted not to even speak, but she feared the tense silence returning. You left a trail, Valyn said neutrally. Asta let out one small chuckle, though it seemed painful to do so. Do you make a habit of following every trail you see? No. Ah, so just mine then. Valyn felt her cheeks begin to turn pink, and she hastily went back to neutrality. I did not know it was you. Asta smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. All the better, I would think. If you had known it was me, perhaps you would have turned the other way. She should have. Every minute that passed felt like torture. Valyn wishing silently that the rain would let up and allow her to leave as soon as possible. She could not stand the sadness on Asta's face, the way her voice felt brittle as glass, or the way this girl, who had always been so bright, seemed to dim. She wanted to ask what had happened, but it would not matter. This would be the last time they saw each other. She had to make sure of it. Valyn heard Asta shuffle and watched as she leaned the back of her head against the cave wall, her eyes closing. Rather kind of you, anyhow, once you saw it was me. Kindness had nothing to do with it. It was simply bad luck, which Valyn was chock full of. She shouldn't have been surprised, even as her chest remained tight with a worry that she could not banish. Don't you want to know why I'm here? What happened to me? Asta asked. No. All right then, she replied. We can rest in silence until the rain stops. I'm too tired for conversation anyway. I just have one more question, Lady Valyn. Indulge me? The promise of silence was enough to convince her. Perhaps she could close her eyes and pretend Asta was not there, and the time would pass more comfortably. What is it? Will you promise to stay with me? Just until the storm passes. I do not think I can stay awake much longer, and I fear being alone here. A small request, to watch over her as she slept, in return for peace and quiet. Valyn did not have to think about her answer. Very well. Asta turned her head, her blue sky gaze reaching Valyn. Thank you, she said, and the smile reached her eyes this time. So, the rain poured on, and Asta slept. Her chest rose and fell softly, her expression peaceful in the darkness. Valyn found herself watching her until the storm began to wane, sunlight returning to the forest, the birds resuming their songs. Valyn stayed still, so as not to disturb the other elf, her dark eyes memorizing the girl's pale skin and gentle features, replacing the image of her tangled hair with how she had seen it days before. Valyn thought that Asta had to be around her own age, with a loving community and days filled with laughs. But was she wrong? What had made her run to the lake, to cry alone in a cave? More importantly, why did Valyn care? The sound of an animal disturbing leaves outside roused Asta, her lashes fluttering and her body unfurling like a flower. She stretched, and Valyn noticed the winces Asta tried to hide as her body moved, but said nothing. The other elf ran her hands through her hair, fingers getting caught in knots. As she tugged through them, she turned to look at Valyn. You stayed, she stated, as if it had been a test Valyn passed. Valyn said nothing. Asta let out a long breath, preparing herself. She rose as tall as she could within the confines of the cave and brushed out her skirt. Her hand gripped the strap of her bag tightly, too tightly, as if it were the only solid thing she could feel. Valyn stood up as well, realizing she was blocking the exit, and stepped outside. Before she could get very far, a cold hand wrapped around her wrist, the touch like an electric shock running up her arm and freezing her on the spot. Wait, Asta pleaded, her grip tightening. Is this truly goodbye? It had to be. Valyn had memorized Asta's face in preparation. The image of her was all she could have, as the real thing was too much. So she nodded, but she could not move her arm away. Asta's hand began to shake, yet she still clung to Valyn. I am sorry. It is my fault you feel that you must leave your home. What must I do to convince you I mean no ill will? What must I do to convince you that you can stay? Nothing, Valyn thought. She could not trust her words, even if Asta swore on her own life that she would never return to the woods again. Life was a fleeting thing, after all. The townspeople would find Valyn, and they would try to kill her, and in turn, they would all die. No being was a match for magic, but that did not mean they wouldn't try. Valyn already had one town bloodying her hands. She did not need another, not if she could help it. But when Valyn turned to face Asta, her breathing stopped. Asta was a painting, a piece of art depicting so many things, and Valyn could not begin to keep up. Sadness, anger, pain. It was overwhelming, like she was standing in a deafening crowd. Valyn felt suffocated, but the picture of Asta's face was all she could see, all she could feel. The worry would not leave, and it was terrifying. She could not afford to worry about anyone, and yet here she was. Valyn could hardly remember the last time someone had been in her life. But now, she realized that since the day she'd met Asta, a hunger had begun to grow. This girl could satiate that hunger and become someone to her, if Valyn allowed it. The voices of the magic began to tickle at her mind, sensing her rapid thoughts. Yes, they said. Hungry. So very hungry, starving. Feast upon her. Valyn knew their appetite was of a different type, and she took it as a challenge. Perhaps she could have Asta in her life somehow, without giving in to the magic's desires. It was a risk, a gamble. But if she could do it, if she could muster the power to defy the voices, perhaps she could be rid of them. That was what she told herself, a reason as solid as stone on her conscience. But an unease within her hinted at something else, something far more tenuous. Was it instead that the loneliness and years of isolation had finally taken their toll? It felt as though she was sinking, and now she was desperate for any lifeline presented to her. It was a terrifying thought, that the feeling could control her so. She could not let herself surface from her punishment, let herself dream of a day when she was not drowning. The stubbornness towards the magic was one thing, something with consequences only for the girl she barely knew, since Valyn had no real ties to her. If she died, she died, and while it would not please Valyn, it would be a lesson learned. If she were giving in to her loneliness instead, she ignored the thought. I will stay, Valyn said, her voice coming out much softer than she'd thought it would. You mustn't let anyone know where I am, and you mustn't tell a soul you've met me at all. The consequences would not be on me, but on you. Swear this, and I will stay. Asta's face brightened to a level Valyn could scarcely believe possible, and her other hand met Valyn's free wrist, the second touch sending another wave through her. I swear, she confirmed happily. I will tell no one. Just our secret. The words would have to be enough. If not, Valyn would not be the one to pay the price. It would be the girl made of moonlight that would grow dim, and Valyn steeled herself for that fate. What was one elven girl's life in exchange for a town? What was one more demise upon her own hands? Whatever lay in store between them, Valyn knew in her heart it would run red.